I think that maybe we could discuss everything again with everybody later. So perhaps one or both representatives from each group could come forward, and then we can try to conclude everything. So please don't leave us alone here at the front. So I've been wondering, what is the essence of it all? Because of course we covered very different things in these 5 theme tables, and various objects or issues were addressed. Especially with the slide on climate change, there were of course different dynamics in the discussion, and overall it probably isn't strictly consistent or entirely logical in its structure, but what the essential things or aspects, but what are the essential things or aspects that we came up with here, and I made a few notes from these presentations. So one important point for me was the idea of foresight or prevention, so thinking differently about how we deal with historical monuments in a way that we don't react but look ahead proactively. And furthermore, I'll just mention the points and then ask for addition. So firstly, on a disciplinary level, how do other disciplines or other forms of heritage conservation deal with specific problems, including internationally? Is there perhaps already a solution to a problem that we have in Portugal or Sweden or somewhere else nearby, so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel? And another point was participation. So firstly, involving citizens, residents in addressing specific problems, also by creating incentives through engagement, and also encourage them to deal with and contribute to these matters. Participation also relates, as we heard in the last presentation, to monument owners, so creating incentives for them to proactively engage with their property. Additionally, in several presentations, we addressed the idea of methodical rethinking. That means thinking methodically about how, for example, we approach the topic of monitoring, how we look at historical monuments preventively or afterwards and observe any changes over certain periods. Considering whether we can or must do something in the short term, or if there is time to wait longer, but also this also involves methodical rethinking regarding documentation. So perhaps there are new technologies that can help us simplify documentation, and of course the question of how we make this documentation accessible is also relevant. And this all goes beyond the research domain, which was also mentioned. So it is crucial that we have best practice examples available, and of course they need to be collected, examined and accessible, and this then helps us move forward. Data collection is a part of it, and it was also mentioned collecting data and making it accessible. So Johanna Leisner from the Fraunhofer Institute mentioned at a conference in Leipzig that there is actually a lack of climate database nationwide. So not only do we have a data problem in heritage conservation, but the data collection for the cause itself, for climate change, is still inadequate. So one thing I haven't heard much about, or just briefly, or was just briefly mentioned, is education. Now, I am not sure if it's taken for granted that education is included, or if it's simply less emphasized, but it was mentioned that we have a shortage of skilled workers. And last year I had a conversation, this was also in Leipzig, I think, with where a colleague said, well, at universities they deal with the topic of identity, but they don't do much about climate change. And I don't personally agree with this statement, but it raises a question. Namely, how can we proactively respond to these changing conditions in education and make it an integral part so that it can be taken into account not only in practical heritage conservation, but also in legislation and in all the framework conditions. But now I would like to open up the question to this matter. So what is our essence actually? What is the message? What are the most important points we want to capture and convey? So I would like to add something briefly, so how we understood it is that regarding the topic of education, we've been discussing it in the context of communication because, as Reinhard Revello said yesterday, if people can't read what historical pollution or facade is, then trying to communicate it won't help because they simply won't understand. So that's something already known, but in turn it's something that we also need to try to convey. Two aspects complement each other. Thank you. So the question to everyone is, have we forgotten anything important now? And are there points that we must communicate, that we need to articulate? How can we create incentives to not only engage with this topic, but also deal with it in a way that ultimately leads to changes? What do we want to convey now to policymakers, heritage conservation, universities, and all those people interested in this field? Last year we had a meeting organized by the German National Committee, or it was basically a joint discussion and deliberation with experts whom might not have been in close contact with heritage conservationists. And an important topic which Christina Kraftzig strongly emphasized, although she can't be here now, but is to change mindsets. So we not only have a cultural problem with the risk of losing our architectural heritage, but we also have a massive economic problem. Almost every building serves a purpose, has real estate value, and someone might be paying off a mortgage for it. So these are not just our noble cultural values, there are also economic values. And of course, this doesn't... I'm not desperate about the situation at the moment because I think that there might be other motivations to handle our heritage carefully and to continue working on it and maintain it. Because right now we don't have the materials, the skilled labor, and also the interest rates are very high, so the conditions are not favorable for tearing down and rebuilding monuments. And yes, so that could be an alternative if everyone worked on their mindset and said, yes, let's all contribute to this joint project. Because we don't have a relatively small historic building stock, whether it's classified as monument or just worth preserving, which makes no difference in terms of economics, and we should continue to handle it with care. And perhaps we should, so I already mentioned, we should reevaluate some of the appearance-related standards and maybe suspend them for a certain number of years and instead focus more on the substance. And maybe at certain points we should be a bit less strict regarding appearance-related issues and proactively share our knowledge of heritage conservation across different disciplines. We've come a long way, and the enrichment of knowledge in heritage conservation over the last, say, 50, 60 years is tremendous. Although we didn't invent all of it within our two generations, of course, everyone has surely read older literature on heritage conservation. And when they realize that it deals with completely different things, like the early dating of the Speyer facade or whatever it may be, this is all still important, but today we are diverse and to some extent truly interdisciplinary sector in the construction industry. And here we don't need to hide, and we shouldn't let ourselves be labeled as always grumbling, but perhaps we are also a bit too reserved with our knowledge and not proactive enough in sharing it. So these are my two perspectives: to be more flexible in certain areas where the appearance of the monument might not be affected for a certain period, but its substance remains intact, and in other aspects, sharing our knowledge. These are my two conclusions and wishes. Thank you. I understand that heritage conservation is increasingly intertwined with societal problems and discourses, which likely enhances its societal significance and in turn also allows it to contribute more to societal development or the resolution of issues that concern us all. Also just far beyond just heritage conservation. So my statement now is also related to what's written on the 10 boards behind us, and it's, in my opinion, this is not an unsolvable task. I leave this event with a more positive outlook than when I came here, but however, this is not something that we should communicate to others, because otherwise the politicians might say that we don't need funding or support programs after all. But in fact, yes, we do need them. And what we have written on those boards, in my opinion, is something that is achievable for society as a whole. And I believe that these processes are necessary and that we can afford them as a society, if we don't wait too long, of course. Yesterday, Mr. Rode also showed that we need to take action now, especially in areas where research and knowledge are lacking. So there are many things that we still cannot do because we don't have the solution for them yet. But we need to take action to now create model projects, to generate solutions, and to implement them within our lifetimes. And the question now is, how do we proceed? And that's where I'm a bit concerned about how ICOMOS will continue with this, because documenting and publishing the results alone is not the solution. That's just one step forward, and it might be better to play it out elsewhere. But as a general statement, I believe that if we all work together, that this is a solvable task. Especially if we approach the questions together. Sometimes, as we saw in other disciplines, as we talked about yesterday, it might be necessary, like in nature conservation, to step back a bit and accept certain solutions. For example, we talked about a specific example yesterday, namely the solar panels on the roof, which might not look nice and we might not want them, but the possibility still exists. And if we are a bit more flexible in our thinking and allow ourselves new ways of thinking that we haven't allowed before and stay in interdisciplinary exchange, then we can achieve that, and I think that that's crucial. Does anyone else want to contribute? Yes, I just wanted to thank you for this format in general. I find it great that through this workshop format and interactivity, all generations and all the participants here have been involved, and that it re-establishes the connection to our studies here at the university. The opinions that were expressed in today's discussion can be brought back into teaching, and this transfer of knowledge, which I think we all found on the boards, is actually really happening here. And yes, I think that it is great how this event was organized and how we could all communicate and interact with each other, so thank you very much. Thank you, we're glad to hear that, and that was, of course, also what we intended to do. The idea was that we can only achieve this together with different associations, different generations, and not just through lectures where we just sit and listen, but through discussions, exchange, and conversations. So I heard it earlier in the discussion where education and further education were discussed. It was about the question of networking possibilities. So let me say again to everyone, you should get involved somewhere, become a member of ICOMOS. The emerging professionals are always welcome, and there are opportunities and you can make a difference. You can do it together with other emerging professionals, with us, for example. So it's a good approach, a good starting point to participate in such a network and take opportunities to work on this topic or other topic as well. So contact us, and I can only encourage you to get involved, because this is a chance to shape things, and yeah, ultimately ICOMOS does what its members do or want to do. So without the members we are nothing, and it is important that we get new people in, young, fresh ideas, and people who engage with this topic and other topics and want to stay in the loop and work on it as well. Also, if you need a recommendation to become an ICOMOS member, my email address is known, so we already have a practice in writing recommendations, so don't hesitate to contact me. Yes, you can find mine as well. I can also write recommendations. Yes, maybe to open this up again, Mrs. Bernhoff already mentioned it. The big question is what's next. So I believe that if we put what we heard here today into writing over the next few days or weeks and look at it with a systematic perspective, that it can lead to a cohesive result. And we can publish it, convey it, but of course that's not the end of it. Perhaps as a brainstorming, what are the essential steps to move forward? Do we need to organize workshops? Do we need to cooperate more with universities? What are our suggestions in that direction, so that what we have generated here doesn't just stay among us or those who read the publications, but maybe that there are ideas to really reach out to society and ideally also to politics. Because we've seen it, there are criticisms of funding possibilities, particularly regarding climate change. And just the open question is now, what are wishes or visions on how to continue this whole process? So let me make a first suggestion. I believe we need to reach out to the responsible individuals in different institutions. And there are many through different committees and associations. And if you look at who really is involved in monument conservation, there are a lot. And I believe that at the moment, what we need to do is to actively promote this topic repeatedly and emphasize its urgency and the passing time as well. And I don't mean that in an apocalyptic way, but rather we are the ones being called upon as the 2 or 3 generations currently active in different areas. So I think that it's important not to hesitate and to keep repeating and promoting it patiently and over again. And I think that this all needs to become a widespread movement, so it shouldn't only concern those who were here or other places which are involved. And it's not a voluntary task either, whether we do it or not. It's the subject of our work in the coming years, and this is also what we get paid for. So So I can only advocate for contributions and discussions to be held and repeated. Of course, I've been to several events on these topics, and there is always something new. Some things are repeated while others are new. So I think that we should keep discussing this topic in various constellations and all continue to educate ourselves regardless of our age. Of course, this is not a completely new topic that we're talking about here, but the urgency that we face now is new, is something we need to deal with. Yes, in your presentation yesterday, you already mentioned that we had this broad movement 50 years ago. And perhaps we should take another look at that. The conditions are different now, and the reasons are also different, but maybe we can find ways to reach more people in society. What we need here is a stronger networking across professional associations and interest groups. And we have achieved that here with different organizations coming together And of course, there could have been 10 more organizations joining as well. And maybe that will be the case for the next event. But the question that concerns me is still, how do we create and how do we make such networking happen? And to what extent do we need the networking? And not just at the level of president and executives, but also at the working level in some way. So the question then arises, how do we organize something like that? And who even has the capacity for it? So I'm a bit puzzled, or rather the ideas are there, but the question is, who will do it in the end? And I can tell you about our experience from conservation sciences. We had a conference with similar topics and realized at the end that we needed more networking. So we just set up an email distribution list across all professional associations without any pretense of status or hierarchy. And what we do now is just exchange information. If someone says there is a great event or a job opportunity, at least everyone gets to know about it, and not just those within a specific association like the German Association of Conservator Restorers, so the VDR, but also people who are not a part of it or not part of the Research Alliance for Cultural Heritage, which I also mentioned today. So without institutional backgrounds, without association structures, simply saying there is a person who collects email addresses and sets up an email distribution list, and if someone has something interesting to share, they can just send it to the group. I don't know if that's a solution in this case, but that is certainly an idea. But honestly, we try to use the conservation science platform to push for more funding from the government, and so far it's been €1. So I can't say it was successful. The success that we have is that we meet twice a year to keep each other updated, and that's what we want and what we need, but it's not enough for the climate change issue. But it could be such an initiative to simply connect with each other, to identify the actors. Yes, exactly. We mentioned that yesterday. There are so many initiatives, actors, and perhaps research projects, and we don't have a complete overview of them. So collaborating with associations, jointly organizing conferences and engaging in discussions is half of the battle, I think. And it's easier to organize when multiple minds are thinking together. It's faster, it's simpler, and we avoid duplicating efforts as well. Of course, now we are not in a situation where the German National Committee of ICOMOS, so the DNK, will hold the same conference next week, but instead we have found a starting point together and can use a jointly signed statement as a basis to move forward and maybe involve others in the future as well. But it's crucial to keep each other inside and think together, because we need this impact from many minds and many people so it doesn't drift apart. So the DNK was founded as a pool of various actors, and many of those present here are nominally members of the DNK, including the Association of Conservator and Restorers and the Working Group for Theory and Education in Monument Preservation. And I think that such information networks could be a pragmatic starting point. And of course we can sit down again together after this and think about how something like that could work. Because of course we are a bit short regarding staff and personnel. But again, this is what we are paid for, and DNK would have another augmentation level for such a distribution list as well. So I don't have a concrete idea, but I feel a little bit of discontent, because it seems like we are at the end of brainstorming sessions thinking that we already have a solution. However, I would like to emphasize that we still have more questions and some solution approaches, but perhaps in a different circle where architects working for investors and climate scientists might be present, our position might be somewhat relativized. I think that it's good to continue the discussion. Maybe we don't need to say we're writing a book, because that implies that we've already decided everything and you can read about it later. But personally, I still see many questions, even though we say we have been doing this for a long time. But what it means specifically for practice as preventive monument but what it means specifically for our practice as a preventive monument conservation is that it's a different step, and that's why I wouldn't approach it as something definite that's coming. And yes, thank you. So that's why the question, how does it go on, remains, because we don't have a solution yet. We only have questions, but we also have some hope. And Paul Bellendorf expressed that, and I think that's what it is now. There are starting points, directions that can be further explored concretely, but it's clear that it's just one of many cautious first steps, of course. So we won't have solved this in 5 to 10 years. It's a very long process, but the question is, how do we continue wisely and meaningfully? So are there any more comments, advice, wild ideas? Because we're open to everything, and the goal is to gather these thoughts. Yes, I would like to mention the aspect that Mrs. Wendland brought up. So if you consider how many associations are involved in some way, which are not academically inclined but low threshold and engage, it's quite significant. For example, the so-called Friends of the Old Town of Nuremberg, so the association have 7,000 members, and they already have their distribution lists. That means if we want to quickly reach a dedicated public that is already involved with monuments but not academically oriented, then these would be the right strategies. So Bamberg also has something similar to the Altstadtfreunde, so the Friends of the Old Town, and they are all involved and they understand what it is about. But what we need to do is just stop looking down on everything. That's why your approach is exactly the right one. And if we want to communicate things, we have to tackle exactly these avenues that already exist. And I would say that with one stroke, we could reach 30 to 50,000 people, and that's a wonderful distribution network that we can organize within only a week. Thank you for the suggestion. Is there any other input, or are there no further comments? So if there are no further comments, then I would like to conclude here, and I hope that we all stay in touch. I also want to pick up on the hope expressed by Ms. Bernhoff, that this is something worth continuing to work on, because there are possibilities to eventually somehow at least get a handle on the issue, if not solve it. So thank you very much to all speakers, moderators, participants, to the technical team, and everyone who participated and contributed to the topic table. So special thanks to the Competence Center for Monument Science and Monument Technologies at the University of Bamberg. Thank you to Paul Bellendorf, Franziska Prell, Stefan Breitling and the team, the German Federal Environmental Foundation, the German National Committee for Monument Protection, the Association of State Monument Authorities and the funding agency, and also the Federal Commissioner for Culture and Media. Thank you very much. I hope you also gained something from this and that it encouraged further thinking, and I hope that you will continue to participate in the future. Perhaps maybe even become a member of ICOMOS and continue to be engaged in the field of monument preservation.